Chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 24. The subjects of divorce and remarriage are spoken of on several occasions in the Old Testament, and while most of those are short passages with very few relevant details to our discussion, there is one passage which is critical to understand properly. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. Quote, 1. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house. 2. And she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. 3. And if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, 4. Then her former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. End quote. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. Deuteronomy chapter 24, a logic puzzle. I think that most people miss the importance of Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4 in terms of its doctrine about remarriage after divorce, especially when considering its far-reaching implications for both Old and New Testament teachings. This passage serves as a foundational text that shapes the traditional view of marriage, divorce, and the boundaries around remarriage, providing key insights that are echoed in Jesus' teachings. I will argue that Jesus in the New Testament was not giving the people a new doctrine about divorce and remarriage. I think he was simply correctly interpreting this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 24, which the people in his day had twisted for their own purposes. I will make the case that this passage is essentially a logic puzzle with one conclusion, that while divorce is allowed because of indecency, remarriage is always forbidden while the other spouse lives. In other words, it teaches the same doctrine that Jesus taught in the Gospels, that Paul taught in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and the same traditional view of the early church about divorce and remarriage. The Pharisees missed the point. In the Gospel accounts, the Pharisees questioned Jesus about the lawful reasons one could divorce their wife. On those occasions, it was this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 24 that they were essentially asking about. Quote, some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? End quote. Matthew chapter 19, verse 3. Quote, they said to him, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? End quote. Matthew chapter 19, verse 7. The Pharisees wanted to know the reasons that a man could divorce his wife. They wanted to know if the reason needed to be something big, like fornication, or could it be something small, like burning food in the kitchen? By all historical accounts, the Jews of the day were almost obsessed over this question. You might say it was one of their favorite topics. A considerable portion of the Talmud is devoted to the issue of divorce and how to do it properly. I would argue that this topic would have been far less intriguing if the traditional view had been accepted, that if someone got a divorce, they would be forbidden from remarrying. The lack of potential for remarriage would have significantly dampened the enthusiasm for debating divorce, especially for those interested in finding legal loopholes to justify their actions. The Pharisees were concerned with the same thing modern Christian teachers are concerned with. That is the exception clause. But if remarriage after divorce is forbidden, then the exception clause becomes far less important to everyone. The exception for divorce was important, but it was never the main issue. The prohibition of remarriage was. Let's chart it out. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. Remarriage after divorce is adultery. Yes. Marrying a divorcee is adultery. Yes. Divorcing improperly equals guilt of adultery. Yes. Sex is reversed. No. Exceptions for divorce. Yes. You can see in this chart that I am claiming that this passage in the Old Testament is teaching the same things as the New Testament passages, and it's now up to me to defend that position point by point. Exceptions for divorce. I'll start with an easy one. Verse 1 clearly indicates that there is an exception for divorce, which is translated here in the New American Standard Bible as indecency. Jesus agrees with the Pharisees that there was an exception for divorce in this passage, when he said in Matthew chapter 19, verse 8, quote, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives," end quote. Though Jesus makes the important distinction that Moses only permitted divorce, whereas the Pharisees wrongly claimed that Moses commanded it. The word used in this exception clause is indecency, and it is just as vague as the word fornication used in the New Testament exception passages. But like fornication, indecency probably has something to do with sexual sin. Here is what D.A. Carson says about it. Quote, "But what was the indecency in Moses' day that allowed for divorce? Something indecent could not be equated with adultery, for the normal punishment for that was death, not divorce. Though it is not at all clear that the death penalty was in fact regularly imposed for adultery, nor could the indecency be suspicion of adultery, for which the prescribed procedure was the bitter water rite. Yet the indecency must have been shocking. Ancient Israel took marriage seriously. The best assumption is that the indecency was any lewd, immoral behavior, sometimes including but not restricted to adultery, that is, homosexuality or sexual misconduct that fell short of intercourse." End quote. So what this word means may be up for debate, but the fact that some kind of exception for divorce exists in this passage seems to be agreed by everyone. Even the no-divorce proponents tend to agree that this passage allows for a divorce exception, though they would argue that it doesn't apply in the New Covenant, an issue we will address in chapter 12. Divorcing improperly equals guilt of adultery. This is another somewhat easy one because this passage speaks about the procedure of a proper divorce. For example, in addition to mentioning indecency as a condition, it also implies that the following things must be done. 1. Write her a certificate of divorce. 2. Put it in her hand. 3. Send her out from his house. As mentioned before, the Jewish people obsessed over this verse. There is an entire section of the Talmud devoted to discussing various aspects of proper divorce procedure based on this passage. Take, for example, the idea that one needs to write the wife a bill of divorce and place it into her hand. Here are a few examples of the Talmud expanding on this idea. One may not write a bill of divorce on anything that is attached to the ground, that is, a leaf attached to a tree. However, if he wrote it on something that is attached to the ground, and then he detached it, signed it, and gave it to her, it is valid. If the husband throws the bill of divorce into the wife's airspace, and it comes to rest within her domain, the divorce may be valid even if it doesn't land directly in her hand. And delivering a bill of divorce by throwing it through a window or down a chimney into a room where the wife is present can be valid. While this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 24 does not list any specific punishment for what would happen if a man divorced his wife for a reason other than indecency, I would argue that the punishment Jesus described in Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 would apply here, that the man would be guilty of causing the wife to commit adultery, and thus he would share in the guilt of her adultery. I can make this argument because it's the logical conclusion of the rest of this passage. What I mean is that the woman in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, does the very thing Jesus said a divorced woman would do in Matthew chapter 5, verse 32. She wrongfully marries another man despite her husband still being alive and thus commits adultery and becomes defiled. In this particular case, in Deuteronomy chapter 24, the original husband did divorce her properly, so he is innocent of her adultery. All this can be gleaned from this passage, but we need to go further to explain how. Remarriage after divorce is adultery. This is the big one. If I can show you that this passage teaches that remarriage after divorce is adultery, then it would be significant. It would mean that the Pharisees and 99% of modern pastors fundamentally missed the point of this passage. Remember that the Pharisees and the Sadducees did not teach that this passage forbids remarriage. Remarriage after divorce was considered totally acceptable by them, as well as by modern Jews, something we will talk at length about in chapter 8. I am not alone with my interpretation that this passage forbids remarriage after divorce. John Piper, a prominent Christian pastor, agrees that it is the logical conclusion of this passage as well. Quote, "The remarkable thing about these 4 verses is that, while divorce is taken for granted, nevertheless the woman who is divorced becomes defiled by her remarriage." Verse 4. It may well be that when the Pharisees asked Jesus if divorce was legitimate, he based his negative answer not only on God's intention expressed in Genesis chapter 1 verse 27 and chapter 2 verse 24, but also on the implication of Deuteronomy chapter 24 verse 4, that remarriage after divorce defiles a person. End quote. There are others who agree with this interpretation, of course, but it is still the minority view. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. The logic puzzle. I will paste the passage here again, as we will need it for reference. Quote, 1. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house. 2. And she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. 3. And if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, 4, then her former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. End quote. The question that we need to solve is this: what causes the woman in this passage to be defiled? Everything rests on this one point. If, as I will argue, she is defiled by remarrying after her divorce, then this passage is teaching that remarriage is a sin, and the Pharisees and everyone else should have known it. Their arguments for her defilement. Since the majority of modern-day pastors teach that remarriage is acceptable after divorce, you can imagine that they would have to have a good explanation for the woman's defilement in this passage. Here are some of their arguments, along with my critiques. Defilement due to remarrying the first husband. Probably the most popular view is that the woman's defilement comes as a result of marrying her first husband after a divorce. They essentially teach that this passage exists to warn people not to remarry the first spouse after a divorce. My critique. This cannot be correct because it clearly says that the woman had already been defiled. In fact, that's the very reason that the man is forbidden to marry her again, because she has been defiled. Quote, then her former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. End quote. Clearly, her defilement happened before she returned, so it cannot be that marrying her first husband again is what causes her defilement, since that didn't even happen in this example. In addition, this passage cannot simply be teaching that a divorced person cannot remarry their spouse. If that were the case, then why even mention verses 2 and 3, the verses about her remarriage to a second spouse? Why not just say, if you divorce your wife, you can't get remarried to her? Why would you need to even bring up that she got remarried in between? It would be completely irrelevant. Clearly, the remarriage in verses 2 and 3 is an important clue as to her defilement. Defilement due to the initial indecency leading to the first divorce. Another possibility is that the woman was defiled as a result of the initial sin, indecency, that caused the man to want to divorce her in the first place. This has more merit, as it would solve the timing problem in the previous example. Though I will argue later that this is not the reason this woman was defiled, I think that it's certainly possible that an indecency, erva in Hebrew, which was committed by the woman, could have caused her to be defiled. Erva in the Hebrew means nakedness, but it is used for several types of sexual sins. In Leviticus chapter 18, many sins involving erva are mentioned, and many of them lead to defilement. So it's certainly possible that a woman could commit an erva-related sin that could defile her. However, I don't think that's the point of this passage for the following reasons. My critique. Like with the previous example, if the point of this passage was that you can't remarry the same woman after you divorce her for indecency because that indecency defiles her, then why spend the next 2 verses talking about her irrelevant remarriage to another man? Why not just say, you can't remarry someone that you divorced for indecency because she is defiled by it? Another reason I think that this isn't the correct reason that the woman became defiled in this scenario is because it doesn't fit with the protasis and apodosis of this passage. In legal terms, protasis and apodosis are parts of a conditional sentence, often found in legal texts and biblical passages. The protasis is the if part of a conditional sentence, the clause that sets the condition. The apodosis is the then part of the conditional sentence, the clause that explains the consequence or result of the condition in the protasis. So it would look like this in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. 1. Protasis, the if conditions. Verse 1. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house. Verse 2. If, after leaving his house, she becomes the wife of another man. Verse 3. If her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, or if her second husband dies. 2. Apodosis. Then the law. Verse 4. Then her first husband, who divorced her, is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. This is declared detestable in the eyes of the Lord, and it warns not to bring sin upon the land that the Lord is giving them as an inheritance. So, her marriage to the second husband was a condition of this law being given. This strongly suggests that the marriage of the woman to the second husband is the reason that the original husband is forbidden from marrying her again. The logical conclusion of this passage, if this was true, is that remarriage is forbidden. Defilement from multiple marriages. Another argument for what defiled the woman in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, is essentially that being divorced twice is one too many times, or alternatively that some indecency in the second marriage which caused the divorce was the reason for her defilement. My critique. The woman in this passage was not necessarily divorced twice. The example also allows that her second husband simply dies, quote, or if the latter husband dies, end quote. In addition, the woman's conduct in the second marriage cannot be the problem. Quote, and if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, end quote. In other words, the woman in this scenario could have been completely innocent of any wrongdoing in the second marriage, because if the original husband dies, leaving her an innocent widow, and yet Moses still forbids her from remarrying her original husband, then it proves that her conduct in the second marriage was not the reason for her defilement. It must have come before the end of the second marriage. In conclusion on this point, I agree with Jack Shannon in his book Contra Mundum Swagger, where he says of Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, quote, the most natural reading is that the second marriage defiles her, end quote. Marrying a divorcee is adultery. The final point on our chart is marrying a divorcee is adultery, which I believe is clearly taught in this passage. That is, if our previous premise is true, then the woman is defiled by the second marriage, and so obviously you cannot marry a divorcee, or you would enter into a defiling relationship. Does this passage approve of remarriage? Some have argued that this passage teaches that remarriage is okay because it shows that the woman remarries after her divorce in verse 2. This is ridiculous, because the passage simply says that the woman remarries after the divorce, not that this remarriage was approved by God. If we apply that logic to other laws in the Old Testament, where similar apodosis and protasis are used, then in the following passage we must conclude that God is okay with us striking other men with stones during a quarrel. Quote, "If men have a quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die but remains in bed, if he gets up and walks around outside on his staff, then he who struck him shall go unpunished. He shall only pay for his loss of time, and shall take care of him until he is completely healed." End quote. Exodus chapter 21, verses 18 and 19. Simply stating what happened to set up a law is not the same thing as saying that such actions are approved. A really bad Bible translation. Some Bible translations go so far as to deceitfully add language that suggests that God approved of the woman's remarriage in this verse. For example, look at how the New Living Translation translates verse 2. Quote, "When she leaves his house, she is free to marry another man." End quote. There is nothing whatsoever in the Hebrew that could justify this translation that the woman is free to marry the other man. Young's literal translation, which follows very closely with the original Hebrew, says, quote, "And she hath gone out of his house, and hath gone and been another man's." End quote. Almost all the Bible versions on BibleHub.com follow this pattern for Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 2. Take the New American Standard Bible, for example. Quote, "And she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife." End quote. In other words, this verse is simply stating the fact that she got remarried, not that God endorsed that remarriage or that she was free to remarry. The New Living Translation is shameful and reckless. What about Leviticus chapter 21, verses 7 and 14? In Leviticus chapter 21, there are two verses that mention that priests could not marry a divorced woman. Does this imply that non-priests could marry those who had been divorced? Quote, "They shall not take a woman who is profaned by harlotry, nor shall they take a woman divorced from her husband, for he is holy to his God." End quote. Leviticus chapter 21, verse 7. Quote, "A widow or a divorced woman, or one who is profaned by harlotry, these he may not take, but rather he is to marry a virgin of his own people." End quote. Leviticus chapter 21, verse 14. Not in the New Covenant. Even though I don't think this means that lay people were allowed to marry those who were divorced in the Mosaic covenant, I want to first point out that even if it were true, marrying a divorced person is clearly forbidden in the New Testament. Quote, "But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." End quote. Matthew chapter 5, verse 32. Quote, "Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery." End quote. Luke chapter 16, verse 18. Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, and Luke chapter 16, verse 18 both prohibit marrying a divorced person. This prohibition is without qualification, so we can be confident in saying that the New Testament expressly forbids marrying a divorced person. Priests forbidden to marry divorced women? Leviticus chapter 21 describes various things that priests can and cannot do. The overarching idea was that priests, because they made offerings to God, needed to be more careful than the rest of the people to avoid defiling themselves or becoming unclean. Laws for everyone. While it's true that some of the laws in this passage are only applicable to priests, many of them are unlawful for every Jew, not just priests. The reasons they are mentioned specifically for priests in the passage vary, which I will discuss later. For example, in Leviticus chapter 21, priests were also forbidden from doing the following: profaning the name of God, chapter 21, verse 6, making baldness on their heads, chapter 21, verse 5, shaving the edges of their beards, chapter 21, verse 5, making cuts in their flesh, chapter 21, verse 5, and marrying foreign women, chapter 21, verse 14. Taking the Lord's name in vain, profaning the name of God, was one of the 10 Commandments, which applied to everyone. Quote, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain." End quote. Exodus chapter 20, verse 7. As for the other 3 practices, making baldness, shaving the edges of beards, and making cuts, these were pagan practices that the surrounding cultures performed to worship their gods. These were also commandments given to the general population a few chapters earlier. Quote, "You shall not round off the side growth of your heads, nor harm the edges of your beard. You shall not make any cuts in your body for the dead, nor make any tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord." End quote. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 28. Marrying foreign women was also expressly forbidden for all Jews, not just priests. Quote, "Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons." End quote. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 3. Thus, we can see that these laws for priests cannot be exclusively for priests alone, or at least not in every case, as some of these commands apply universally. But why then does the passage specifically mention divorced women as forbidden for priests to marry? It's about virginity. In the passages in question, we see that priests were forbidden from marrying anyone who had previously had sex. This is emphasized by mentioning a mixture of lawful and unlawful examples: prostitutes, divorced women, or widows. Quote, "They shall not take a woman who is profaned by harlotry, nor shall they take a woman divorced from her husband, for he is holy to his God." End quote. Leviticus chapter 21, verse 7. Quote, "A widow or a divorced woman, or one who is profaned by harlotry, these he may not take, but rather he is to marry a virgin of his own people." End quote. Leviticus chapter 21, verse 14. The point being made here is not that it's okay to marry prostitutes as long as you are not a priest, but rather that God, for reasons I am sure are good, does not want priests to marry anyone who has had sex before. They must marry a, quote, "virgin of his own people," end quote. The reason for listing every category of a woman who has had sex before, prostitutes, divorced women, or widows, is to ensure that there are no loopholes. Only virgins are permitted for priests. Conclusion. This passage, when carefully analyzed, reveals a consistent teaching that aligns with Jesus' interpretation in the New Testament. While divorce may be permitted under certain circumstances, remarriage is not sanctioned while the original spouse is still living. The Pharisees, as we have discussed, missed the central point of this passage. They were preoccupied with the conditions under which a man could lawfully divorce his wife, debating the nuances of indecency and the proper procedures for issuing a certificate of divorce. This focus overshadowed the deeper moral and spiritual implications of remarriage after divorce, which Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4 subtly but critically addresses. By treating the passage as a logical puzzle, we concluded that the woman's defilement arises from her remarriage after divorce. This defilement is not due to her initial indecency or any wrongdoing in her second marriage, but stems from entering into a new marital union, which causes both her and her new husband to commit adultery against her first husband. In our comparison of this teaching with those of Jesus and Paul, as shown in the chart, we see a unified view on the prohibition of remarriage while the original spouse is still living. Recognizing that the passage does not endorse remarriage, but instead warns against it, underscores the seriousness with which we should approach the covenant of marriage.